On May 4, 2019, Lakes District Air's Cessna 182 Foxtrot Lima Victor November was conducting a fire surveillance flight in the vicinity of Smithers, British Columbia, with the pilot and 3 crew members on board. Approximately 3 hours into the flight, the pilot transmitted a Mayday before communication was lost. The aircraft wreckage was located in a forested area 500 feet north of the Babine River and 5.6 nautical miles east of the Silver Hilton Steelhead Lodge airstrip. One crew member survived the crash and was transported to hospital by helicopter. The pilot and the other 2 crew members were fatally injured. The probable cause, a concept taught in the first 10 hours of flight training. Hi, I'm Kat, and this is your Bush Brief. The pilot's name, according to several sources, was Peter. He had retired in 2013 from a career as a corporate and airline pilot. At the time of the accident, he had accumulated over 46,000 hours of flight time. 73 of those hours were in the 182, Lima Victor November. This was the second summer in which he flew for Lakes District Air Service. There were 3 passengers on board, Lauren Borgel, Amir Seghi, and an unnamed survivor. Lauren Borgel was a prominent BC business leader and the CEO of Precision Vectors, an aerial mapping company contracted by the BC Wildfire Service. He was a well-known figure in the ski industry, having previously served as the CEO of Whistler Mountain and the Hudson Bay Mountain Resort. Amir Seghi was a 26-year-old talented researcher and GIS specialist who worked for Lauren Borgel's company, Precision Vectors, as part of their aerial mapping team. The airplane was a 1962 Cessna 182E model. The original engine, a Continental 0470, was replaced with a larger 0550 in 2004. Both engines are carbureted, as indicated by the O rather than IO, which would indicate a fuel-injected model. The 550 engine had 1,736 hours on it since its last major overhaul. The next major overhaul was required at 2,500 hours. It's important to note that the airplane records indicate that the aircraft had an ongoing history of carburetor airbox repairs. The airplane took off from Burns Lake Airport at 5:41 a.m. The purpose of the flight was to scan for hotspots of previous fire activity for British Columbia Wildfire Service's Northwest Fire Center, located in Smithers. Part of the work area where the scanning took place was about 50 nautical miles north of Smithers. The area is quite undulating and surrounded by mountains with limited level terrain. There are quite a few cut blocks in the area which have access roads. There are very few stagnant lakes. The Babine River and the Shelagodi River converge in the area. The Silver Hilton Steelhead Lodge is located at an elevation of approximately 1,700 feet above sea level. On the day of the accident, the graphical area forecast for the Smithers area called for broken cloud layers at 14,000 feet and scattered clouds at 4,000 feet. The GFA indicated that while general visibility was over 6 miles, there were localized areas of freezing fog where visibility dropped to a half mile with ceilings at 500 feet. The upper winds at 6,000 feet were forecast to be 21 knots from the west. Now this next bit is where it gets really important. See if you can guess why. A nearby weather station, located 14 nautical miles from the crash site, recorded temperatures around 6 degrees Celsius with dew points near -1 degree Celsius on the morning of the accident. Similarly, Smithers Airport reported temperatures between 9 degrees Celsius and 11 degrees Celsius with dew points around 1 degree Celsius. At both locations, winds remained light from the north-northwest at less than 10 knots. Pete and his passengers were working about 2 to 3 nautical miles southeast of Silver Hilton. The Northwest Fire Center required pilots to check in every 30 minutes with an ops normal transmission. At 8:21 a.m., Pete checked in operations normal. 11 minutes later, the engine performance degraded and he radioed the fire center and advised them that he would be putting the plane down at Silver Hilton Lodge, 2.5 nautical miles to the northwest. Just 1 minute later, at 8:33 a.m., he advised that he was unable to reach the Silver Hilton Lodge and would be putting the plane down 5 miles west. However, he actually put the plane down 5 miles east. He was disoriented. When I look at the flight path and the pilot's altitude, it looks like Pete could have made the runway at Silver Hilton. He transmitted 1 minute previously that he intended to land there, so he certainly knew of it. Prior to his engine problems, his flight path also took him to within less than a mile of the lodge, where he was in a gentle right-hand turn, which meant the runway was located out the pilot side window. Surely he saw it. The TSB notes that the Silver Hilton coordinates were not available in his GPS. If he was not super familiar with the area, it's possible that all the previous circling and direction changes disoriented him to the point he was unable to determine the direction back to Silver Hilton. The runway at Silver Hilton is a very challenging one as well. It's only 1,800 feet long with just 1,200 feet of usable runway. An internet search reveals a previous crash in 1992 where fishing legend Laney Waller was the sole survivor of an airplane that landed long and eventually crashed in the river at the east end of the runway. It also looks to me, after examining the runway with Google Earth, that it is only safe to approach from the west because of the rising terrain to the east. Given the winds are predominantly from the west, this seems to be the ingredients for disaster given the length of the runway and the steep drop-off to the river at the end. However, I doubt a 46,000-hour pilot in an emergency would avoid the runway for these reasons. The TSB reports it was likely Pete was not able to locate the runway in sufficient time. At 8:35 a.m., Pete transmitted his final call stating his coordinates and his decision to land in the trees. The airplane struck multiple treetops along a 500-foot path before striking a large tree trunk and descending steeply towards a small berm, coming to an immediate stop. 3 of the 4 occupants were fatally injured. The surviving occupant, who was seated behind the pilot, was found outside the airplane about an hour later. By now you might have an idea of what happened. The TSB is fairly certain it was carb ice that initially reduced the engine's ability to produce enough power to maintain altitude and eventually led to a complete loss of power. How was this 46,000-hour pilot not aware of the favorable atmospheric conditions as well as the symptoms of carb ice? The temperature and humidity in the area where the flight took place were conducive to serious carburetor icing at any engine power setting. In addition, the mission required the aircraft to be operated at low ground speeds, which necessitated a partial power setting that made the engine even more susceptible to the formation of carburetor ice. The combination of the aircraft operating at a partial power setting and in atmospheric conditions conducive to carburetor icing likely resulted in ice forming in the carburetor. The GPS data shows that when the aircraft's performance started degrading, the aircraft started a shallow descent that lasted for almost 2 minutes, consistent with partial engine power. This was followed by a steeper descent that lasted for over 3 minutes, consistent with a complete engine power loss. The ice that likely formed in the carburetor would have initially reduced the engine's ability to produce enough power to maintain altitude and eventually led to a complete loss of power. The carb heat control was found in the cold position. Pete owned 3 carbureted aircraft and would have been familiar with the operation of carburetor heat systems, so it does seem unlikely that he would not have applied it in these circumstances. The investigation also considered other scenarios. Carburetor heat may have been selected on at some time before the crash, but was possibly returned to the cold position before impact. It is also possible, though less likely, that the carburetor heat control was returned to the cold position when the carburetor airbox was crushed at impact. But ultimately, the TSB found that if carburetor ice had indeed accumulated, it could not be determined why it would not have been removed or reduced by the carburetor heat system. An engine teardown did not reveal any mechanical cause for an engine power loss. Maybe the carb heat wasn't working correctly, but given Pete's enormous amount of flying experience, I would think he would have caught it during his run-up. Based on the findings, I don't think Pete considered carb ice as a possible problem. He was probably thinking fuel or some sort of internal engine failure. Given his altitude and complete lack of landing options, there was likely a bit of urgency, too. He had very little time to try and solve the problem as finding a suitable landing location became the priority. As it turned out, it was a fuel problem, just not the kind of fuel problem you expect. To prevent carb icing, you must understand the conditions that create it. The primary danger zone is between -5 degrees Celsius and 18 degrees Celsius, or 23 degrees Fahrenheit to 64 degrees Fahrenheit. This is especially critical when the temperature and dew point are close together, indicating high relative humidity. In these conditions, the temperature drop inside the carburetor venturi can easily drop below freezing, turning atmospheric moisture into ice that restricts airflow to the engine. Detection requires monitoring your instruments for subtle changes. In an aircraft with a fixed pitch propeller, the first sign of ice is a gradual, unexplained drop in RPM. If you have a constant speed propeller, you must watch for a drop in manifold pressure. As the ice accumulation worsens, the engine will begin to run rough and vibrate. If you suspect ice, you must immediately apply full carburetor heat. When you apply heat, expect a specific sequence of events. First, you will see an initial drop in power, RPM or manifold pressure, because heated air is less dense than cold air. Second, if ice is present, the engine will likely run even rougher as the melting ice turns into water and passes through the cylinders. Turn the carb heat on and leave it on. If you don't, the engine may stop producing enough heat to melt the ice. Keep the carb heat on until the engine smooths out and you see a gradual rise in power, signaling that the induction path is clear. Following the initial engine problems, Pete the pilot indicated an intention to land at Silver Hilton Steelhead Lodge airstrip. However, the aircraft tracked away from the airstrip and the pilot reported that he would land west of it, when in fact the aircraft crashed east of it. The airstrip was not in the aircraft's GPS database, and as a result, the TSB concludes it's likely that the pilot was unable to locate it in sufficient time to conduct a safe landing before the engine failed. If it wasn't in the database, how did he know it was there? During his engine problems, it appears he flew close enough to Silver Hilton to be able to locate it visually. However, he was also dealing with an emergency at the time which required a lot of his attention. The Babine River was raging and no gravel bars or open shorelines were visible. In such circumstances, pilot training at Lakes District Air Service suggested forced landings should be made into trees, not water. These factors may have contributed to the pilot's decision to make a forced landing into trees rather than to ditch in the river. With all due respect to Pete the pilot and his incredible career, it appears he made a mistake. This means all of us could make the same mistake too. It appears he was unaware that the atmospheric conditions were highly favorable for the formation of carburetor ice, therefore not recognizing the symptoms of carb ice and subsequently failing to take proper action. Hopefully this video was a good reminder of the conditions prime for carb ice. If you fly a carbureted airplane, make sure you know the dew point spread and the relative humidity before you go flying. Also, make sure you know the signs and symptoms of carb ice formation. This was certainly a great reminder for me. When we are flying in the bush in a single-engine airplane, we should always be ready for an engine failure by constantly scanning for possible forced landing locations. Sometimes we are too busy to scan, in which case we should have a premeditated, prioritized list of possible go-to options, such as nearby bush runways, logging roads, gravel bars, shorelines, or, as a last resort, treetops. Where would you land in the bush during a forced approach when your only options are the trees or the water? Would you land in a river? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for checking out my channel. I hope this video prevents further accidents due to carb ice. My condolences to the families. Like, share, and subscribe for more bush crash analysis and education.